You look like you've never been told no and it's made you boring, she said to him. He didn't fall for her when she toned herself down. He fell for her the moment he realized she never would. Some people enter rooms and rearrange them, not with charm, but with the quiet threat of being completely unbothered by your opinion of them. Zola was that kind of person. Seo Junho had never met anyone like that, mostly because he'd spent 15 years paying people to care about his opinion. He was worth $4.2 billion. He hadn't really laughed, in 4 years. And the first thing she ever said to him was, "You look like you've never been told no and it's made you boring." She wasn't trying to provoke him. She was just telling the truth. That was the problem. That was the whole problem. The question isn't why he noticed her. The question is why, out of every person who had ever moved through his life, she was the only one he couldn't figure out how to make leave. Seo Junho wakes at 5:12 a.m. every morning, without an alarm. Not because he's disciplined, because sleep for the last 4 years has been something he negotiates with rather than surrenders to. His penthouse occupies the entire top floor of a building his company built. Seoul spreads beneath it like a circuit board, lit, precise, and different. He has staff who anticipate his needs before he voices them. A schedule maintained with surgical consistency. Meals at the same time. Meetings in the same configuration. Silence always before 8 a.m. From the outside, it looks like a man in complete control of his life. That's exactly what it's designed to look like. His wife, Hyun Seo, died 4 years ago. She had argued with him once in front of 6 people at a dinner table. And he had found it, startling and then slowly, the most awake he had felt in months. He had never told anyone that. 41 days after her diagnosis. He did not take time off. He closed a $900 million acquisition the week of her funeral. People called it strength. His board called it extraordinary. Billionaire grief looks like productivity. Nobody questions it because the output is impressive. His assistant, without informing him, sublet the adjacent residence to a visiting fellow, a researcher from Atlanta, in Seoul on a 2-year urban anthropology fellowship. Her name was Zola. He didn't know she existed until a Tuesday morning when he stepped onto the shared rooftop terrace at 6 a.m., expecting, as always, silence. The terrace drew no one else at this hour, which was precisely why he used it, and heard the urgent, layered brass of Fela Kuti playing from a Bluetooth speaker at a volume that suggested she had never once considered that anyone else might be present. She was cross-legged on the bench with a thermos and an open notebook, head moving slightly with the music, completely unbothered by the Seoul skyline, the cold, or him. He stood there. She looked up, didn't turn the music down, poured a second cup from the thermos, and held it out. He said nothing. She said, "It's ginger and cardamom. It won't kill you." He declined, went back inside, sent his assistant a message with 3 words. Explain the sublease. The explanation, when it came, was straightforward. The sublease had been executed under a standing property management authorization he had signed 18 months prior and forgotten. It was legally binding for the term. Reversing it would have required action. Lawyers, notices, a process that would have taken longer than the fellowship itself. He read the message, filed it, did not respond. He wasn't offended by her. He was disoriented. He stood at his kitchen window for 6 minutes after going back inside. He was supposed to be reviewing contracts. He stood at the window. He told himself he wasn't paying attention to her. And then he noticed that he knew she left for her research site at 7:40 a.m., that she came back after dark most nights, with a tote bag that was always overfull, that she laughed on the phone, loudly, completely, without checking who could hear, switching between Yoruba and English, and then, occasionally, Korean that was imperfect and unashamed in equal measure. He understood, intellectually, that people lived this way. He had simply not been this close to it in a very long time. She left books on the rooftop bench, different ones, rotated every few days. The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. A worn Korean paperback he recognized, Urban Theory, 1990s, out of print. He didn't touch them. He read the spines. On Thursday of that first week, he asked his assistant to pull her fellowship profile. Dr. Zola Adeyemi. Atlanta, Georgia. Visiting Fellow, Seoul National University. Research focus. Emotional infrastructure in post-industrial urban corridors. How cities carry feeling in their bones long after the people who built them are gone. 3 published papers. 1 award he'd never heard of from an institution he had to search. He closed the tab, opened it again 40 minutes later, while pretending to review a land acquisition brief. On Friday, she knocked on his door at 11 a.m. He answered it himself. His house manager was out, and she stood there with her tote bag and the particular energy of someone who had already moved on to the next 4 things in her mind. She said, "The black SUV in Bay 4, is that yours?" He said yes. She said, "Cool. I need that space Tuesdays. I'm getting a rental for site visits and the Bay assignment doesn't make sense for my schedule." Then she waited. Not anxiously. Just waited. The way you wait for information you've already decided you're going to use. He said, "I can have my assistant arrange a different Bay." She said, "Tuesday works. Thank you," and left. In 15 years of business, he had negotiated with ministers, sovereign wealth funds, men who controlled shipping lanes. Every one of them had framed their needs as proposals, as requests that understood their own precarity. She had not proposed. She had not requested. She had simply informed him of what she needed, assumed competence on both sides, and moved on. Upper-class power is largely the power to make requests feel like favors, to frame need as generosity, to make the other person grateful for the opportunity to provide. She didn't operate that way. She wasn't disrespectful. She just hadn't been trained in the particular performance of smallness that wealth expects from people who need something from it. She didn't shrink the ask. She didn't apologize for having a need. She didn't make him feel powerful for meeting it. Junho found this, against his will, against every pattern of his adult life. Fascinating. Here is what looks like boldness from the outside. A woman who takes up space without permission, who speaks without softening, who makes requests that don't arrive wrapped in deference. But that reading is too simple. What she had wasn't fearlessness. Fearlessness is the absence of fear. What she had was more specific than that. She was unafraid of him, not of consequences, not of conflict, of him, his name, his net worth, the particular social gravity that had caused every person in his proximity for 4 years to angle themselves slightly toward him, like a room full of plants toward a window. She just stood there, upright, facing her own direction. She noticed him too, not in the way he noticed her, cataloging her schedule, reading her book spines, pulling her profile. More simply than that, she noticed that he was the only person in the building who was on the rooftop before the city fully woke, that he stood at the window of his kitchen at a specific hour, not looking at anything in particular, that he moved through his own life the way someone moves through a house they've stopped seeing. She had watched enough cities to know what that looked like. The specific stillness of a place that has been optimized past the point of being lived in. She was not trying to fix that. She was not built for the project of softening people who had chosen their own edges. But she had spent 2 years in a city that was not hers, among people who received her work with careful, professional warmth, and nothing else. And she had begun to feel, in a way she hadn't fully named, the specific hunger of wanting to talk to someone who might push back, who might say something that cost them something to say, who might be, genuinely, inconveniently, unexpectedly, interesting. She had not expected that person to be him. The power went out on a Wednesday evening at 7:18 p.m. The whole building. He was on a call he didn't finish. She was apparently entirely unbothered, because when he stepped into the shared stairwell with a flashlight, she was already there, seated on the 3rd step from the landing, annotating a book with a red pen by the light of her phone propped against the wall. He almost went back inside. He didn't. He asked, almost involuntarily, the way you ask something before the part of you that manages appearances can stop it. "What are you reading?" She held up the cover without looking at him. Henri Lefebvre, The Production of Space, he said. "The Nicholson-Smith translation?" She looked up then, really looked at him. For the first time, not as a neighbor, not as the man whose parking space she needed, but as someone who had just said something that required her to reconsider a prior assumption. She said, "You've read it," he said. "In the original French." A pause. Not awkward. Calibrating. They talked for 40 minutes in that stairwell. Not about grief. Not about wealth. They talked about cities. About what it means for a place to carry memory in its bones. In the width of a street, in the height of a ceiling, in which neighborhoods get parks and which get highways. She said that urban planning in post-colonial cities is often grief work that nobody named grief. He said that he had torn down 3 buildings in the last decade and only understood what he'd done to the streets around them afterward. She stopped writing. He noticed her stop. He kept talking. He said something, a specific observation about the emotional function of unplanned public space, about how cities that over-optimize for efficiency quietly destroy the infrastructure of spontaneous human contact. And she looked at him the way people look at a page when a sentence lands harder than they expected. She didn't perform composure. She didn't neutralize her reaction into a professional nod. She said, I didn't expect that from you. Not cruel. Not flattering. Just honest." He said, "What did you expect?" She thought about it genuinely, which was itself unexpected. She said, "Someone who thinks about cities as assets." He said, "I do think about them as assets. And I've started to think that might have cost me something I can't price." She had spent years in academic spaces where Black women are required to perform certainty twice as precisely to be taken half as seriously. She had learned to armor her intellect, to enter every room already prepared for the specific exhaustion of having her ideas received with skepticism before they were received at all. She had learned to be right loudly enough that the volume made dismissal harder. He had spent years in boardrooms where his intelligence was assumed by the title that preceded his name. Nobody had questioned his thinking in over a decade, which meant nobody had sharpened it either. Neither of them had been simply curious, with another person in a very long time. Without performance, without the particular loneliness of speaking into a room that has already decided what you are. In a stairwell, in the dark, in a city neither of them fully belonged to. They were for 40 minutes, just 2 people genuinely interested in what the other one thought. That specific experience, that clean, uncomplicated intellectual curiosity, is rarer than desire. It is more dangerous than attraction, because desire you can manage. But finding someone whose mind makes you want to keep talking, that is much harder to walk away from. The power came back on. The lights in the stairwell returned, too bright after the dark. They both stood. She gathered her book and her red pen. He said, "Your annotation in chapter 3, are you arguing against him or with him?" She paused at her door. "Both, depending on the city." She went inside. He returned to his apartment. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter, the unfinished call still logged in the application, a document waiting for his review. He sat on the couch. She invited him the way she did most things, without ceremony. A knock on his door on a Saturday afternoon. "My fellowship group is gathering at mine tonight. Food, conversation, nothing formal. You can come if you want." Not, "Would you like to?" Not, "I'd love it if you could make it." "You can come if you want." Then she walked back to her apartment before he answered. He told himself he went out of politeness. The gathering was 11 people in her living room. A sociologist from Lagos, a documentary filmmaker based between Paris and Nairobi, 2 urban planners from Seoul National, a poet who taught at Yonsei, a journalist, a historian of Joseon-era architecture who laughed at everything and apologized for nothing. The room smelled like jollof and sesame and someone's specific taste in jazz. It was loud in the way that rooms are loud when the people inside them are genuinely interested in each other. Junho entered, and the room didn't shift. Not the way rooms shifted for him. There was no subtle straightening, no reconfigured sentences, no one angled toward him with the particular attention that wealth produces in spaces that recognize it. They greeted him the way you greet someone's neighbor. Pleasantly, without weight. She introduced him once across the room to the filmmaker. "This is Junho. He lives next door." Not, "This is CO Junho, chairman of." Not, "You might recognize the name." Junho. He lives next door. The filmmaker shook his hand, asked him if he'd seen a particular documentary about Cheonggyecheon Stream, and moved on when Junho said he hadn't. That was it. That was the whole introduction. He stood near the kitchen for the first several minutes with a drink he wasn't finishing. He's used to rooms adjusting to him. The adjustment is so consistent, so ambient, that it has become invisible, like pressure that you only notice when it lifts. In this room, it had lifted completely, and what he felt in its absence was not relief. It was disorientation. The specific disorientation of a man who has confused the architecture of deference around him for the architecture of his own personality, and is only now, in a room that offers neither, beginning to sense the difference. He didn't know how to simply be present, without the organizing principle of other people's awareness of him. He had forgotten. Possibly he had never learned. She watched him from across the room. She had seen this before. Not him specifically, but this. The moment when someone whose money has always functioned as social currency enters a room where that currency doesn't convert. She had watched it go two ways. Some people became condescending, began to perform expertise, began to speak more than they listened, to locate themselves at the center of conversations they had only just entered, to assert value through volume because the room wasn't providing it automatically. She watched him to see which way he would go. He went quiet. He listened to the sociologist describe her fieldwork in Kano. He asked one question, careful, specific, genuinely curious, about the relationship between informal housing markets and community identity formation. The sociologist looked at him with mild surprise and answered fully. He didn't speak again for 20 minutes. He just listened. The filmmaker caught Zola's eye across the room. She looked back at her drink. He stayed 2 hours longer than he planned. At the end of the night, at her door, he said, "Thank you for including me." She said, "You were actually fine in there." He paused. "Fine. Yeah." She leaned against the doorframe. "Some people aren't. In rooms like that." She went inside. He rode the elevator up one floor. 14 seconds. He spent all 14 of them turning the word over. Fine. Not impressive. Not gracious. Not a version of the compliments he received daily, inflated to match what people assumed he needed to hear. Fine. An observation. A passing grade issued without interest in his reaction to it. And he understood, in those 14 seconds, that there is a specific kind of person who has been told they are extraordinary for so long, that being called fine, by someone who meant it plainly, without subtext, without strategy, feels more honest than anything said to him in years. The elevator opened. He stood in it a moment longer than necessary, then stepped out. He went to bed at his usual hour that night, lay in the dark for a long time, thought about the word fine. Here is what the story looks like from the outside. A cold man, a disruptive woman, walls coming down. It's a clean narrative, familiar, easy to hold. It is also wrong. He wasn't cold. Cold is a personality. Cold is a choice made early and maintained without effort. What he was preserved. And preservation is different. Preservation is what happens when someone intelligent, someone who has felt the full cost of being open, decides, consciously, methodically, that the risk of feeling is no longer one they can afford to carry. And so they do what intelligent people do with unmanageable things. They build a system around it. Routine, output, efficiency, control. They manage their interior life the way they manage everything else that threatens to become a liability. Like a balance sheet. Every emotional variable accounted for. Every exposure hedged. This is not coldness. This is a man who felt something so large that he decided, in the aftermath, never to be that exposed again. Hyenesio died on a Thursday in October. She had been his wife for 9 years. Before that, she had been the only person in his adult life. The only one who spoke to him before she knew what he was worth. They met before the second company. Before the name meant what it came to mean. She had disagreed with him openly, in public, at a dinner where 6 people were watching. He had found this, then as now, disorienting, and then slowly necessary. She had a way of looking at him that did not include his net worth in the calculation, not performing indifference to it, simply not organized by his net worth. With her, he was not the chairman, not the heir to a name that carried institutional weight in 3 industries. He was a man who overworked and underslept and sometimes said the wrong thing and needed to be told. A man who was loved anyway, not despite his flaws. Not in a transaction where love was the return on emotional investment. Anyway, simply and completely anyway. When she died, he didn't just lose her. He lost the version of himself that had only ever existed in her presence. The version that was simply Junho. No modifier, no title, no number attached. That version of him had no other witness. She was the only one who had ever seen it clearly enough to hold it. And when she was gone, that version went with her. What remained was competent and controlled and deeply, structurally alone. And everyone around him called that strength. Because the buildings kept going up, and the deals kept closing, and the numbers kept moving in the right direction. Grief that produces is grief nobody intervenes in. So nobody did. The 4 years of not laughing. The 4 years of not walking that street in Jongnyo. The 4 years of sleep as negotiation rather than surrender. All of it the same 4 years. All of it the same Thursday in October. Now, the reframe. Because the audience has been watching Zola as the variable in this story. The disruptor. The force of nature. The wild card who wandered into a still life and started rearranging it. That framing also needs to be taken apart. She isn't wild. But that word, and what it reveals about the people who reach for it, is worth examining properly. We'll get there. What she actually is. Radically self-possessed. Not a personality trait. A decision made and remade daily at significant cost. She had chosen to hold. There were rooms she had left and not gone back to. Papers she had pulled from journals where the peer review made clear, without ever saying so, that the problem was not the argument. Conversations where she had made herself smaller. Once, twice, and then stopped and felt the door in those rooms close quietly behind her. She had paid, in the currency of belonging, for the decision to stay whole. She knew the price. She paid it. She did not stop paying it. And she had arrived in Seoul, 2 years into a fellowship that was professionally excellent and personally isolating, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right, in rooms that would rather she were easier. 2 people then. One who lost himself through grief and rebuilt around the absence. One who fought to stay herself against every room that suggested she shouldn't. Both of them, in different ways through different damage, had arrived at the same specific loneliness. The loneliness of being in the presence of people who are responding to a version of you that isn't entirely true. That is the real premise of this story. Not wealth and disruption. Not cold and warmth. Recognition. What it costs when you don't have it. What it feels like when, without warning, you do. It is a Thursday evening in late November. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, that simply settles into the city. She is on the rooftop at 9 p.m. with her field notebook and the thermos. Always the thermos. And the particular focus of someone who does their best thinking when the city has gone slightly still. He comes through the rooftop door. Doesn't pause when he sees her. Doesn't construct a reason for being there. Walks to the other end of the terrace and sits. She doesn't perform surprise. Doesn't adjust her posture or close her notebook or offer conversation as a courtesy. She keeps writing. He sits in the cold and looks at Seoul laid out below them, lit and moving and entirely indifferent to either of them. They stay like that for a while. The silence between them is not awkward. That is new. That is, if you are paying attention, everything. She says, without looking up from her notes. I was in Yuljiro today. There's a block between the old print shops and the new construction, where people slow down without knowing they're doing it. I've watched it 3 times now. Different people, different hours. They slow down, and then they speed back up, and they don't know why. The block used to be a market. Demolished in 2009. The street remembers. The people don't, but their bodies do. She keeps writing. He is quiet for a moment. Then, there's a street in Jongnyo I haven't walked down in 4 years. He says it the way you say something you've been carrying in a closed room for a long time. Not dramatically. Not as confession. Just as fact. Offered plainly to the cold air, and to her, and to no one in particular. She doesn't say I'm sorry. She doesn't say tell me about her. She doesn't put her pen down and turn toward him with the careful posture of someone preparing to receive grief. She doesn't convert what he said into a moment of connection. She simply receives it, lets it exist in the space between them, exactly as he gave it. Keeps writing. He has been around people who handle his grief like a project, who hear it and immediately begin to do something with it. Comfort it, contextualize it, reflect it back to him in language that is meant to be helpful and is instead organizing. As if pain, when witnessed, must immediately be processed into something more manageable, more socially appropriate. She doesn't do that. She just lets it be there. His grief and the cold air and the city and her handwriting moving across the page. All of it present. None of it converted. He doesn't know what to do with that. Except feel it. Actually feel it. For the first time in 4 years. In the presence of another person. He is not managing. He is simply sitting with something true. And she is simply sitting beside it. That is the rarest thing. Not sympathy. Not understanding. Presence without agenda. The willingness to let someone's pain take up space. Without immediately trying to make it smaller. Several minutes pass. The city moves below them. She turns a page in her notebook. He says, Zola. Not hey. Not. Can I ask you something? Just her name. Said the way you say something you have been holding carefully. Like he located it somewhere deliberate and brought it out into the open. Zola. She looks up. Recognition. Returned. She looks at him. He looks at her. Soul keeps moving 30 floors below them. Neither of them speaks for a long moment. And in that silence, that particular, earned, fragile silence, the whole architecture of distance they had both constructed, very carefully, over very different kinds of loss, becomes, without drama, without declaration, slightly, less load-bearing. Here is what this story is not about. It is not about a woman who softened a hard man. It is not about wealth discovering humanity through proximity to someone who has less of it. It is not about difference as spectacle. Two people from opposite worlds colliding and finding, against all odds, that love conquers the distance. That version of this story is available everywhere. It is also almost entirely a lie. What this story is actually about is legibility. What it costs to lose it. What it means to find it again. What's easy to miss about this story is that it isn't about opposites attracting. It's about two people who had both, in different ways, stopped being fully legible to the people around them, and who found in each other someone who could read them, not because they were alike, not because they erased the distance between their lives, but because they were both in different ways and at different cost, finally in a room that could hold all of them. Class does not disappear between them. It was never going to. The difference in their material realities is not a misunderstanding to be resolved. His name opens doors that her fellowship never will. Her freedom from the specific anxiety of his world is a freedom he cannot fully access or entirely understand. Culture does not disappear. History does not disappear. None of it disappears. But something else appears alongside those things. Something that does not require the differences to dissolve. The possibility that a person can be witnessed, not summarized, not assessed, not received through the filter of what they represent, or what category they confirm, or what the room has already decided they are. Witnessed, directly, completely, as they actually are. That possibility, that is what appears between them. And it is, it turns out, enough, more than enough. It is the thing both of them had stopped believing was still available to them. He smiles, not at a joke, not at a business outcome. He smiles the way people smile when something they had quietly grieved turns out not to be gone. Not because she fixed him. He was not broken in a way that another person could repair. Not because she healed him. Healing is its own long work, and it was already his to do. He smiles because she walked into a version of him. The version that reads French philosophy and thinks about streets and sits in silence and doesn't know what to do with being cared for. The version he had quietly, methodically, hidden from everyone. And she sat down in front of it, like she had found exactly what she was looking for, like she intended to stay. And that word, wild, it is worth, finally, examining it directly, because it was never hers. It was always theirs. The word of every room that encountered her. And didn't know what to do with what it found. Wild means, you exceed my ability to contain you. Wild means, your existence requires more from me than I am prepared to give. Wild means, I don't know what to do with someone I can't reduce. He had thought it too in the beginning, standing at his kitchen window, watching her cross a room, hearing her name his boredom to his face without apology. He had felt the particular discomfort of someone who cannot be managed. And then, slowly, in a stairwell and a rooftop and 11 people's living room and 4 years of a street in Zhangyo, the discomfort became something else, became the first thing in years that felt entirely real. He had never been more grateful to not contain something in his life. Some things take time to name. That's all right. If this story felt true to something you've been carrying, leave it in the comments. I read them, every one, and I'll be back with another one.